the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre in the UK that AEA Consulting did. And my colleague, Christy Lamb, is going to introduce and present briefly that research. And then the panel, expertly guided by Professor Jeffrey Crossick, is going to discuss some of the implications and the broader themes around the relationship between cultural districts and the creative economy. So, Christy, I'm passing to you with thanks.
Thanks, Adrian. If you give me 1 second, I will share my screen. My apologies, I'm having some issues sharing my screen. Natalia, do you mind sharing the presentation for me?
Yeah, give me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You saved me. All right, so hi everyone, I'm Christy Lamb. I'm a research analyst at AEA Consulting and one of the authors of this report. And we set out to explore the relationships between cultural organizations and the creative industries within a cultural district to see how cultural institutions could contribute to the creative industries in their local area. And as Adrian mentioned, we've convened this conversation today to discuss the findings and themes that emerge out of the study, which we began in the golden days of February of last year, but remain increasingly relevant today as we think about the changing context and importance of place. So to do this, we studied 6 cultural districts across the UK, with Culture Mile in the City of London as our core case study. For comparison, we had 5 other districts: Better Bankside, a business improvement district located in Southwark, London; Salford Quays, a regeneration area in Greater Manchester; the Bristol Harbourside area; Newcastle Gateshead Quays; and Dundee Waterfront. Our approach involved desk research and a literature review, sector definition and mapping of the creative industries, as well as consultation with key leadership and staff, business owners, professionals, and freelancers through interviews, focus groups, and online surveys. So we focused on 4 types of relationships within these districts. Firstly, the supply chain relationships between creative industries and cultural organizations and vice versa. 2, cross-sector skills development and knowledge exchange. 3, place-based impact and branding. And finally, the impact of cultural organizations on the physical growth of the creative industries and vice versa. And so up on the screen, Natalia shared the 4 main findings that emerged from the study. First, the case studies indicated that cultural institutions overwhelmingly had a positive impact on area branding and placemaking. This helped generate spillover effects to creative businesses. This is despite weak direct economic relationships between cultural organizations and the creative industries. So interestingly, where we observed them, they weren't really sustained across the district. Secondly, we also found that the existence of local networks, especially informal ones, as well as higher education institutions such as universities, amplified and supported the relationships between the creative industries with nearby cultural organizations. So it doesn't come as a surprise that many of the consultees, some of which are on the call today, indicated the value of and interest in cross-sectoral R&D initiatives. In some cases, many of these cultural organizations actually acted as testbeds for the work of the creative industries, especially if there were neighboring specialist or technical businesses in the district that could support this kind of work. And as a lot of our case studies were located in busy major city centers, often on redeveloped land, we found that also, unsurprisingly, a major barrier for smaller creative businesses and professionals to relocating to these districts were the lack of affordable living and working space. Next slide, please. So out of these key findings, we developed 7 recommendations and implications for policymaking that would support the continued development of synergies between the cultural organizations and creative industries within a cultural district. 1, to invest in cross-sector innovation initiatives and programs. 2, to provide additional creative workspace and in turn support active creative production in the district. 3, to not only introduce but also support and maintain accessible online networks that crucially bridge both cultural organizations and the creative industries to help open lines of communication and form diverse coalitions. 4, to consult with co-located organizations, businesses, and communities when developing a cultural strategy. 5, to introduce programs that encourage social and cultural equity so that these districts are representative of their communities and contribute to making creativity accessible. 6, to develop municipal initiatives that support cultural production and ongoing research into clustering and the creative industries. And finally, to establish standards for systematic data collection and analysis, for example, to address difficulties with current mapping methodology in capturing mobile businesses and freelancers in particular, with the ambition to easily compare and log the performance of cultural districts. Next slide, please, Natalia. So to discuss the themes that have emerged out of this report, I'm excited to introduce our panel, chaired by Professor Geoffrey Crossick, the Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. First up, we have Malth Abbas, an independent creative producer and the founder and director of Biome Collective, a creative studio and co-working space in Dundee. Sean Bird, head of partnerships and strategic projects at Culture Mile London, our core case study. Joe Lansdowne, executive producer at Pervasive Media Studio, a multidisciplinary creative lab led collaboratively by The Watershed, UWE Bristol, and the University of Bristol. Sari Mersli, head of the Salford Culture and Place Partnership, the body that leads the development of the city's cultural strategy. And Jim Maudsley, principal advisor of events and culture at Newcastle City Council and former chief executive of Generator. I now pass you on to the capable hands of Geoffrey Crossick.
Thanks very much, Christy, and thanks for summarising what is actually a really very interesting report. And I'd encourage other people to read the report if you haven't accessed it already. What is really good about it, one of the strong things about it, is that it doesn't pretend that all is well in this area. It actually intensively looks at case studies and sees what is working, but also sees what isn't working. And that's something I hope we can address in the panel. Just one or two introductory comments from me. I think that the relationship between the cultural sector and the creative industries is a thorny question. Those who are making the argument for public funding of culture often evoke the creative industries as if it's self-evident that the economic importance of the creative industries must justify the public funding of arts and culture. And yet the claims are largely rhetorical. And they're rarely given substance, let alone evidence. And that's one of the things that lies behind the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre commissioning AEA to carry out this research in a precise part of that landscape. It's a question that's worried me for some time, especially when I was leading the Cultural Value Project for the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council, because it seemed to me intuitively correct that the cultural sector was necessary for successful creative industries. But the question was, how do we explore it? How do we test that proposition and what it really means? So this AEA project for the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, about which you just heard the key conclusions from Christy, is hugely welcome because it's an important contribution to answering that question, and to answer it in a precise way by looking at cultural districts, which is not the whole of the cultural sector, but it's an important part of it because they often contain major publicly funded cultural anchor institutions, as well as much else. It's a globally important question, which I hope is reflected in the global audience for this workshop. But the research itself focuses specifically on the UK. And as you just heard, we've got 5 contributors. I can tell you 5 great contributors to this conversation, each of them from a district which contributed to the case studies in the report. What I'm planning to do is to raise with them a series of themes. Although some people might want to respond first, and indeed we can't have all 5 of the panelists responding to every one of those themes, I hope that that they'll engage with what each other say, that from time to time they'll jump in and add points. And I've asked them all to remain unmuted to allow for such spontaneity as Zoom can enable. Also, going back to something I said before about the report, I hope they won't simply tell us about the positive outcomes. Of course we want to hear that, and that's important, but it's actually often even more instructive to learn about things that didn't work, about problems in the relationship, because we know that these kind of relationships are complicated and difficult ones. So positive, but also the problems. One other thing which I think might be a thread that runs through much of this is to hear how policy can influence all of this, whether that be local authority policy or funders policy or explicit cultural districts' own policy, where there's an organisation that can make policy. One of the themes that emerges from the report is the difference between those things that actually happen organically and those things which are the result of policy initiatives. And an underlying thread of what we're going to be talking about, I hope, is the balance between the organic and the policy initiatives. And one last word. The pandemic has clearly impacted on all cultural districts, but I'm a historian and I like to think longer term. I've asked the panel to draw on their longer term experience of these relationships, which after all is what the report is primarily about. That experience over time that will matter whatever the influence of the pandemic, and we can't yet judge what the longer term influence of the pandemic will be. We can guess, but again, as a historian, I know that what people in the middle of a crisis guess to be the consequences is often not the case. Which doesn't, of course, mean that new experience in the pandemic might not be relevant at times, but let's try and lift ourselves above the immediate and look at the longer term issues here. There will be some time at the end for questions from those of you watching. So do feed your questions in through Q&A, through the Q&A rather than the chat. I'll try to pick them up as we go along if they seem particularly relevant to something that's being discussed, but we'll certainly have some time for questions at the end. So that by way of introduction, let me now open up the very first of the 5 themes that I want to raise with our panel, and it's the most general of all. The report identifies 3 kinds of relationship between cultural districts and the creative economy. One of them is the most obvious. It's area branding and placemaking. The second is about exchanging knowledge and developing skills between cultural sector and creative industries. And the third is direct supply chain interactions where services and products flow between the two. What I want to ask the panel is, which of those seem to have happened in your area? Which seem to have the most potential for the future? Sian, can I ask you to lead off on that?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question to look at all 3 of those. And certainly, as you say, branding and placemaking is the most obvious point of connection. And this has certainly been the case in our district. But I do think there's enormous potential in the skills and knowledge exchange area as well. So as those of you who've read the report will be aware, Culture Mile is the cultural district within the City of London, and it's home to the 4 major anchor organisations, so the Barbican Centre, the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, London Symphony Orchestra and the Museum of London. But it also saw the biggest growth in the creative industries anywhere in the country over the last decade. And as you'll see in the report, clusters in technology, in the performing and visual arts, museums, advertising, design. And I think what occurred is that when I first started in this role as partnership manager 5 years ago and before Culture Mile launched, as part of that process, I spoke to numerous organisations across the district to ask them really, frankly, if they had any interest in our plan to develop a cultural district in this area, and ask them about their priorities. And I think it was quite interesting to us all that pretty much everyone I spoke to told me that their priorities were being creative, innovative and entrepreneurial. And that was whether they were not-for-profit sector, cultural organisations or creative enterprises, whether they were HE, hospitality or major corporate firms. So I think what became clear is that they all saw those skills as being critical to staying at the forefront of their industry. And I think it's really this shared story about creativity in its broadest sense that's at the heart of Culture Mile's brand. And we're keen to demonstrate both that social and economic value of creativity, which really underpins our brand and runs through, hopefully everything we do. But I think we also see our role as creating those conditions for creativity to grow. And that is whether that's in the cultural sector, the creative industries, or the commercial sector, or obviously indeed with our residents as well. So, clearly there's a huge opportunity around sharing the different approaches being taken across the area and across all of those sectors to maximise creativity and support its growth, whatever the sector. So, we're doing this in many different ways. For example, only yesterday, we were kicking off our programme which is for local creatives from both the cultural and the creative industries sectors to share their skills and practice, just through a series of online meetups and workshops. We've also been bringing together a programme team led by partners from the world of advertising to run a Fusion Prize project, where they're looking at partnering with our cultural institutions to deliver a curriculum preparing young people for jobs in the creative industries. And, I think it's clear that there's far more opportunities around that skills and knowledge exchange to be done. But I think speaking to your third point, Jeff, about supply chains, that certainly is the most complex. And I think for us, it of course raises the question about what's that rationale for prioritising local businesses over best value, over fair, open procurement? And I think personally there is some justification in supporting local businesses, obviously particularly for job creation and for kind of consolidating that strong local offer. But, as the report spells out, what does local mean in metropolitan areas? So should we, as Culture Mile, for instance, should we be prioritising those organisations on our immediate doorstep in what, to be honest, is a hugely privileged area of central London? Or should we be further strengthening our relationships with organisations across East London, for instance, where, there is arguably greater mutual benefit to be had? I think, clearly it's got to be about getting that balance right.
Thanks, Sian. That's a really interesting overview of some of these issues. Of course, one of the points about supply chain is almost that it's not about. There is obviously an argument about prioritising some businesses over others, but there's also the broader market issue, which is where does the supply chain exist? And if it isn't local at all through the market, then what does that tell us about these relationships? But let me turn to Jim. For Newcastle Gateshead, because that's more of a local authority, or two local authorities actually, but you operate as one in this area through Newcastle and Gateshead Quays. What's your experience of these sort of those three different types of relationship that could exist, that have existed, and what's happened in your area?
So first of all, on the placemaking and branding, it is quite interesting because if you look at the report as well, what's really interesting is it gives you the dates of when certain things came to be. So the two key initiatives that happened on the Gateshead side of the river, or as some people in our neck of the woods quite cheekily call it, South Newcastle. We had pretty much within 12 months, two quite significant buildings open, and one was Baltic, the Centre for Contemporary Art, and then pretty much next door, the Sage Gateshead, which, if anyone's seen images, are two absolutely magnificent buildings, one of them being a former warehouse owned by J. Arthur Rank, of He Who Bangs the Gong at the beginning of old films, which was one of his many businesses. But if you look at that, and then you look at how that area is developed, if you like, and mainly on the Gateshead side. So within the footprint that the report gives, there are so many creative businesses, but they tend to be, as the report reflects, digital tech end of the creative industry spectrum. And so it's really, really difficult to understand and unpick what the relationship was with placemaking and the branding. Now, they certainly wanted to do the branding in terms of Gateshead Quays and use that as a regeneration, and use the two buildings in particular for the catalyst for regeneration. But it probably wasn't for quite a few years later that it really kicked in with those tech businesses and the establishments of other buildings like the Northern Design Centre. And what I found really interesting about it is that how it's now emerged, and they're now talking about branding that whole area as the Baltic Quarter, which I think is also really interesting, because the other Baltic Quarter exists in Liverpool, and their approach was very much like, it's very much a creative quarter, it's very much a creative industries quarter. And what I really like about that was it literally started from a policy perspective of, let's give some creative businesses the opportunity to go into a lot of cheap space that is completely empty and pretty much see what they do with it. So out of that has been born, you know, many great institutions such as oh, escapes me now, I do apologise. There's many sort of creative clusters within creative clusters that have happened there. There's a whole nighttime leisure economy that's grown out of it. You know, it was the sort of area that you went to 10 years ago and there was nothing there. And now you can go there and you know, you can't get moved for Range Rovers and Porsches because there's so much economic and high-end economic activity. And that's really worked. In terms of supply chain between cultural organisations, in my experience in Newcastle Gateshead, it's pretty much non-existent. So even though you see all these great companies existing next to each other, they tend not to interact. I had a meeting with my previous role at Generator, which was a music and creative industries development organisation, with some senior officers at Sage Gateshead. And they recently had a piece of VR done for their building, and they didn't understand that they could have got it done in the building behind them had 30 VR companies in, but they didn't even understand that they were there. So that's really, really, really disappointing. But having said that, fast forward, and you know, those relationships are growing. Live Theatre is home to a great company that are pioneering technology in VR and global brands using their technology to demonstrate cars and how cars work, and even have virtual reality car showrooms. So in terms of the placemaking and branding, I think it's very interesting how you do it. I think you've got to be careful how you do it. I think sometimes if you just put things there and hope that things will react off them, it doesn't work. I think the ones that tended to have worked are the ones like in Liverpool, where they started off slowly and let it organically grow. But the supply chain thing, I think there needs to be a lot more strengthened and a lot more policy at a local level around that, to try and make sure that, and to try and get it going and try and, you know, seed fund it and concentrate on those sort of areas.
Can I throw in a question here, Jim, that's come up on the Q&A, the first one that's come up, and it's about talent flow between commercial and non-profit anchor enterprises. And the person asking the question said that their experience of the density of interactions between district workforces, it's really about the second of these points, isn't it? It's changing knowledge and developing skills. It's the way in which there's a talent flow between them. And in from your experience, Jim, can one see that?
I don't think so. I mean, there's quite a high density of cultural organisations in Newcastle Gateshead. You know, I like to think that in the positives, you know, it's certainly an area, if you combine the two, it's certainly an area that punches above its weight when it comes to cultural institutions. It's got some fantastic facilities, particularly theatre, music, etc. But in my experience, you don't see talent flowing in between them. You know, especially the sort of more technical, more digital side of the creative industries. I think they're seen as very different. I mean, that was what you were saying before, and that's the thing about creative industries. It's so broad that, you know, tech, if you like, which for me is part of it, especially the creative end, the VR, games, etc., the sort of stuff that seems to be prevalent in the cultural mile, for example, software production, doesn't tend to mix with, you know, classical music and visual art. So the talent doesn't really flow. And
clearly, I mean, I really want to move us on in a moment to the next of the themes I want to raise, but this is a good one about the talent flow. And I wonder, you referred to the tech side of it, Jim. Well, Mal, in Dundee, it's very much the key creative industries are very much tech driven, aren't they? Does one see this flow of talent between the commercial and the non-profit in Dundee?
I think we'd like to see it. We'd like to see that flow. It's an obvious pain point, but I think Jim is spot on. There are these natural silos. And the reality is when you're dealing with emerging technology, it's such a specialized skill set and such a quite a risky business operation that the time afforded for you to actually go outside your bubble is very, very limited. I think we've had some great success within the Dundee area, only because of our scale and our heritage and our established kind of small tech and games industry. That's helped us over time, but it's definitely required some policy, but also more importantly, I would say leadership. Individuals who've identified these pain points and gone out of their way to create an organization or a cultural institution to kind of try and resolve these challenges. And I do think, yeah, it comes down to kind of good leadership that's aware of local reality. And the success of Dundee, I would say, is really underpinned by the scale of the city. It's a small city. You know, I'm from Liverpool. I grew up in a massive city. Dundee is the opposite of that scale. It's tiny, but that's just meant that there's a natural flow of knowledge, relationships, etc., etc.
And that, of course, is what a cultural district ought to be able to provide, because there's some intensity even within a big city. But we'll come to that maybe. In the way you've been talking about Dundee, Mal, it leads on to the second theme I wanted to raise with you all, and that's the potential for experimentation and innovation that goes on in a creative, in a cultural district. And that, with relationship between local creative enterprises, could be a real source of innovation, where by some arguments, cultural organizations can be a test bed for innovation in the creative industries. It's a fantastic ambition, but are there examples of where it's really happened? Can we just keep you there, Mal, and see whether you can give that, and before we move on to others?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, in terms of Dundee, there's the obvious things in terms of, you know, V&A Dundee opening up, which is kind of, you know, that's an international story that has definitely galvanized the community and helped bring people together in order to kind of lead up to good experimentation based on understanding the local economy and local population first and foremost. But beyond that, there are other examples like I think of Dundee's Design Festival. Again, the design narrative is quite strong in Dundee at the moment. And so Dundee Design Festival is organized by the local authority, Arts and Culture in Dundee, who, you know, managed to acquire the UNESCO designation of design. And that festival, year on, year out, has really helped kind of, especially from my perspective as a kind of small freelance, small scale business, it's really helped us to kind of experiment and try collaborations in a very, very safe environment. That's really helped us to kind of scale up. So I think through those relationships, we were able to, for example, to put a piece of work into London Design Biennale, right? And then that work is then toured, gone to Bilbao, for example. And those opportunities were only made possible through this kind of established yearly rhythm of opportunity for experimentation. And also just putting different people in the room together, you know, naturally any kind of region has a flow of people coming in and out, right? So you need that kind of rhythm to make sure you check in with the local population.
Thanks, Mel. Now, the Dundee developments you've described about how experimentation and innovation can happen with cultural organizations and form with the creative industries is one that there, I think, has been a much longer history of in Bristol, where Watershed was very much about that from its very inception. But Joe, I wonder if you want to comment from the Bristol experience on this relationship of experimentation and innovation.
Thank you. Yeah. It's really interesting to listen to the other panelists, actually. So at the Pervasive Media Studio where I work, we're about 13 years old. Pervasive Media Studio is not an organization. It remains a project, just a really long-term project, where that rhythm that you're talking about and the notion of bringing people from different backgrounds together in one room has really been the underpinning kind of method that we've been using within that project. So we're a collaboration between Watershed and the two universities, and really provide a big room for about 160 different people who are all in some way kind of interested in exploring creative technology, but from a real diversity of perspectives and disciplines and backgrounds. I think it's about 80% of those residents define themselves as working both in the cultural and commercial sectors. So it's interesting there, I think the flow seems to be much more fluid between them, and often so many of those people are freelancers, which I thought it was really interesting the report highlighted as being very important and often understudied part of the of this kind of ecology that we're talking about. And so often forming kind of teams, kind of doing freelance work with each other around different projects, products or commissions, and kind of moving between companies or not. So yeah, it's interesting, and for us as Watershed, I guess, as the kind of anchor cultural institution in that feels massively productive space for us to be in as well. You know, with the report talks about spillover effect, and I think there's definitely that is true. But for me, I would say the relationship feels much more mutual than that term perhaps suggests. There are, you know, the artists or creative companies working in the studio, innovating around ideas, often create kind of test stories which we are able to leverage for to attract kind of bigger pieces of program funding to then explore those ideas further, hopefully in a way that brings value back to those people, but is also really useful for us and draws an audience into our work as well. So yeah, it's a productive set of relationships.
Thanks, Joe. If we're thinking, and I think that Pervasive Media Studios and Watershed are classic examples of where cultural organizations can be test beds for innovation that then is embedded within the creative industries as well, either through collaboration or by some flow subsequently. Your reference to freelancers is a really interesting one, because it struck me reading the report that maybe freelancers are actually the bridge, the intermediaries, because of the way they flow backwards and forwards in their work. They are the ones who are carrying new ideas, new techniques, new thinking backwards and forwards. And we miss it because in so many ways we don't see what freelancers do. They just move between them. I wonder, before we move on to another question, is there any of the other people on the panel who want to reflect on this issue of cultural organizations as test beds, and particularly the way in which freelancers operate in it?
I'd love to come in briefly about the freelancers thing. And I think even in relation to the earlier question about sort of transfer and exchange between sectors, I can think of many freelancers working in Salford and wider Greater Manchester who are already working across, if you will, the sort of tiles of the creative industries, you know, cultural industries ecosystem. So they might be working in tech companies and production companies. You might have visual arts artists who also do branding and work with fashion design companies in Greater Manchester. So because freelancers wear so many different hats within a portfolio career, they move. And often the big we stay still. So I think the other challenge, actually, instead, I'll just say the findings of the report really looking at those informal networks, if you will, the creative-led, creative being people rather than a, you know, noun. Those creative-led networks end up being so important because they start to galvanize voice, and we start to be able to support the exchange of not only knowledge but understanding and paradigms. But often it needs those informal, almost, you know, freelance-led networks to be able to start to understand and also support their cohesive voice. What might they want to say, whether they're uncomfortable to hear or fantastic to hear?
Thanks, Sari. I'm sorry, Sean. I'm going to move us on.
No worries.
We've got other questions to discuss. Can I say that some of the points that are coming up in Q&A are precisely ones we're coming to later on the agenda, I'm pleased to say. So people are somehow preempting the questions we'd already planned to have. But the next theme I wanted to raise with all of you is networking. The report calls for better networking between cultural organisations and the local creative industries. Much already is about how these things just happen without formal networking. It's seen as a way to overcome some of the difficulties in getting real collaboration to happen. And my own feeling over the years has been that we always call for networking when we can't come up with other solutions to difficult problems, somehow throw people together, find ways of bringing them together. So what I want to ask the panel is, have you been involved in local place-based networking initiatives that have actually helped the exchange of knowledge, of skills, innovation, have made collaborations happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise? And what lessons can we learn from it? Sian, I don't know whether you've anything from the Culture Mile experience to say on that.
I do, yeah. So we established what we called, in fact, the Culture Mile Network, and that's been running for, what year are we in, for 4 years now. Currently, there's just over 50 organisations within that, and it does span the cultural sector, creative industries. And I think, going back to your what's worked, what hasn't, we have tried quite a few different approaches with that. I think in the first instance, it was very much a kind of a forum for dissemination. So we would kind of, in a very one-way fashion, kind of put out news and updates. And then I think we went to the other extreme, and we really tried to kind of empower the members within that network to set up and run their own projects. And I think both had real challenges, frankly. And I think we've settled on a kind of a medium ground, really, which I think is using it as a group of kind of trusted champions and critical friends who we can consult and be our kind of first port of call and pilot ideas with. And I think, what I've learned through that is that there's probably a lot more value actually than I originally thought in that kind of informal networking, that kind of without an agenda, just the pure networking that enables stronger connections across the area to be developed. And a lot of our research from the City Corporation, recently actually has shown us that that's exactly what people are missing at the moment whilst we're all stuck in our little boxes at home. And I think in particular from the commercial sector, they've said that's what they really value about our network, is that opportunity to connect with others in their sector, in a non-competitive environment. There aren't really those opportunities in a subset. Hello? Can you still hear me, Jeff? Is that okay?
Yeah, you're back on.
Yeah.
You're back on again. Yes.
All good? Okay.
Good.
Essentially...
Go on.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I think they've really appreciated a non-competitive environment to be able to make connections. But I think the other thing we've learned is that, what we're looking at is the growth of the creative sector and what really enables that. I think it's clear that a sector that brings together cultural organisations and the creative industries can really go so far in helping with growth. And what's been really critical in our area is a network that brings in non-creative sector organisations. So, if some of the growth barriers for the creative sector are access to new markets, to investment, resilience, business skills, diversification of the workforce, physical spaces, all of those things require non-creative sector partners. So, that's an awful lot of what we're trying to be to do as well, is to give the creative sector as a whole exposure and a platform to connect with non-creative sector partners as well.
Thanks, Sian. And that, of course, takes us beyond the cultural district as such, or can do, to local authorities' role in all of this. And Jim, I don't know whether this issue about how one can facilitate networking and how it works is something that's been thought about in Newcastle Gateshead.
Yeah, I mean, there's some good examples. When I was at Generator, for example, we ran an organisation, a network called Digital Union, which I believe since I've left has been expanded to the wider creative industries. It was a collection of tech and digital and creative digital businesses, and it was just interesting hearing Sian talk about her experiences of how, because that was very, it resonated very much there, that it was very similar in that we introduced them to sort of non-digital, not, generic business like HR and things like that, which were really useful. I know that Sage Gateshead have operated some breakfast network meetings that were really effective as well in the last few years before COVID. So that was really good. I think it's really important. We've just established a culture compact as well, which, while it isn't a network, what has been really, really useful from that culture compact is it has established a network, even though it wasn't supposed to. So the compact sets up various subgroups to tackle and inform cultural strategy of the city, anything from cultural narratives, place and meaning, right through to cultural democracy, comms and engagement of strategies and ideas. And what it's enabled us to do is the compact has its membership, but it's allowed each subgroup to invite specialists and other people. So it's ended up in a really strong melting pot of cultural and creative ideas, not so much business-wise. But I think more can be done by local authorities. Sometimes when a local authority instigates something, though, it can be very seen much as like, oh, do they know what they're talking about? Isn't it going to be a bit boring? So I think from my position, I would rather encourage and stimulate and assist with external organisations to do that work, really, and encourage them to do that work. If we can help in that way, even if it's with a bit of initial seed funding or something, then I think that's the role for local authorities rather than setting up the networks or instigating them themselves.
That's interesting, Jim. Thanks. And before turning to Mal, see what the Dundee experience is here. One of the things that emerges from the report and from other things we know is that freelancers, to go back to freelancers, use the informal spaces of anchor cultural institutions often to do their work. And the networking goes on there. I know Barbican space is often, I call it ground floor, but I know what floor it actually is. I think it's the first floor actually, but the Barbican space is used for that. I know that Watershed has spaces that are used in that way, and Dundee Contemporary Arts, according to the report, has space that's used in that way, where people just informally hang out and networks come into existence because people talk to each other. But Mal, about can
I just jump in as well?
On,
I was just thinking about Watershed does operate like that, and the report highlights Watershed's First Friday event, and we know that informal networking is really important in the creative and cultural sectors. But I think it's important just to say that we also know informal networks exclude, and so actually what we've been trying to do is with First Friday is to think about how we're more proactive about thinking about who do we bring into those spaces and who may feel that they're not, what feels like a very open room to some doesn't to others. So I think it's important to think really carefully about how the invitation is made.
That's really interesting. And in the questions, Dick Penny, who I referred to before, has actually raised the issue of exclusion and whether district places actually can serve to exclude as well as for others to include. But Mal, Dundee.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jim and Joe's point are all spot on. I think in terms of the Dundee experience, as I've come across it, really, it's been external organizations. So my own organization, Biome Collective, we're essentially a band of freelancers, right? And on Joe's point, we're already we've established an organization to try and tackle the kind of the challenges of tech and games in terms of gender split, etc., and how it's really closed off to a lot of people. So we've tried to create essentially a community to open the door and allow people in through small collaborations. And we also run a festival called Arcadia, but with broadly, beyond, ourselves as kind of games makers, experimenters, we do sit in a range of different networks. For example, I can see Gillian Eason is with us today. Gillian is part of, she's the managing director of Creative Dundee, for example, which is an amazing, initiative. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's about leadership, pretty much single-handedly through Gillian's efforts, she's established an organization that essentially has built these networks for us, across the city. And it's very experimental. There's lots of different initiatives. There's kind of regular, go back to that kind of rhythm thing, there's regular events, quite experimental events, even experimental ways of fundraising too. So within the broader Creative Dundee kind of community of blog and events, there's a smaller AMPS community where people can, actually put money towards this kind of collective And, you know, it was really lovely, obviously, especially pre-COVID, where we'd go and visit each other's workspaces, you know. So I can remember having this kind of, you know, a tour of Dundee Rep, for example, or seeing the print studio at DCA, etc., or going to the local city council, etc. Having that kind of behind the scenes those conversations, and the access was quite remarkable. So it's really about experimentation, and I feel that can really only works well when it is external organizations that ultimately have to be empowered by local authorities, because it's a whole thing of, you know, the big ship and the small ship, you know, which one is going to be able to respond and move at pace. And these external organizations are essentially the freelancer, you know, as I am, you know, they are the freelancer with these big, massive fish swimming around them.
Well, let us move on then to where the fish are swimming, which is in a place, because there's a certain paradox here in focusing on place in the way that the report does and that we are in this discussion, because we're pointing to place-based interactions and collaborations and knowledge flows. That's what the relationship between cultural districts and the creative economy is meant to be about, when we know that the creative industries are increasingly operating in globalized and virtual environment. So the question is, and this is something which has come up in the questions on Q&A as well, does place really matter still in the way that cultural organizations and creative industries connect? And I wonder whether the pandemic is one area the pandemic may have forced local interactions as being quite compelling. But I don't know, Sarah, I don't know whether you've got anything, whether the Salford experience has anything to say on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say yes, place matters, and it matters differently than we might have thought it did 18 months ago. But my sense is that it matters even more, just in different ways. I mean, in terms of, this is a report that isn't and has decided not to, understandably, look at the pandemic. With, I guess we're starting to understand trends across. What this is doing is accelerating change in some place. In other places, it's taking disparity and inequity and making it worse. At Salford Quays specifically, a lot of the, I'm going to say some tough reading about what's in the report. We as a group did some work to understand what it looked like from a place perspective and this ecosystem perspective in 2018. And in many ways, we had made plans to start things for 2021. Looking at placemaking in a much more coordinated and participation way rather than just consumption way. But when the pandemic hit, all of that all of a sudden sped up. And rather than waiting to do big things, we did small things that animated place and responded to the needs that were happening. I think one of the big drivers was, rather than saying we need to respond to economic growth, we need to respond to getting visitors back, what we said is we need to respond to people, their needs now. People are losing their lives and livelihoods. The creative and cultural sector have been hit, and we don't know what's going to happen next. And so really, there was a value base that we had sort of shared through a launch strategy literally 24 hours before the pandemic hit the UK. But that gave us a sort of values-based compass to find our way through this. And within that, there was a particular scheme called Box on the Docks at Media City, where, trying to help the hospitality industry, they created sheds and greenhouses, but commissioned 20 artists, specifically Salford-based to begin with, to animate them or create installations around them. Within 3 weeks, Greater Manchester went into Tier 3 and hospitality shut. But in some ways, that changed the dynamics between the artist community, which does not have a place beyond theater specifically at the Quays, and Media City and Salford Quays specifically. The commissioning through the supply chain, all of a sudden, rather than going, we appreciate your work, but we don't value it, to we appreciate your work, we value it, and we want to have this be a collaborative action in terms of placemaking. And I think that there are some beautiful references to both Bristol and Dundee in the sense of pay it forward and fostering as a key point of this, that if the values and are there wanting for a more equitable and exchange across what are divides, the way we naturally might think of us and them in sector ways, in geographic ways, and all sorts of other ways. If there's a value base and it's fostered, then I think the potentials for collaboration around very, tough things like power and prestige, and warmer things like values and ethos, that those actually, those why, the drivers that are about why are we doing this, can really change then the what and the how that goes about it. And again, I'll stick some things in the chat in terms of links.
That's really interesting, Sari, and it takes us beyond place as being something that's simply a geographical entity into a space in which, as you say, people, interests, power relationships, but also values take shape, which can then be available as things change. And when dramatic crises happen, they suddenly become very visible and relevant and important. Sari referred to Bristol in this, Joe. I don't know if you want to talk about this. You were focusing on place and the paradox.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm a big fan of paradoxes or seeming contradictions. So this is where I was sort of naturally drawn to think, oh, I don't quite know what I think about this at the moment, so let me try. And I guess I've got a sort of series of emerging thoughts. It's been really interesting for us this week, actually. Today, before I came to this event, I've been running with colleagues in Lagos a lab. We're doing a week-long lab for local producers, creative producers working in and around Lagos in Nigeria. And we've been doing sessions today around place. So we've asked them to walk through the city, to write kind of creative visions about the future of city. We've been asking them to map their relationship to their ecology, to think about their role in the system. And yet we've been doing it all online. And we're able to do it more cheaply and more easily than we would do, probably than we would have done had we not been in a pandemic situation. So there are ways in which, yes, there is opportunity to connect kind of internationally online now, but I don't think that removes the importance of place, because we're always trying to have those conversations in a way that attends to context. And context is always, I think, a bit about place. You know, the notion of a district is interesting, because I think, as has been previously raised, I think the harbour side around where Watershed is in Bristol, it's not really a residential area. It's an area that we know serves some demographics in the city more than others, and so to focus in a way too much on that place might run in opposition to other ways in which we're particularly interested in operating at a city scale. Actually, the kind of the messy, gritty, diverse system of a city is one that we're always inspired by and interested in. So
yeah, this is really interesting, Joe, because it's the way in which, whether there's a district or not a district, whatever concentration we're talking about has much wider effects and much wider ambitions that are citywide rather than just local. Sian, Culture Mile has no residents, or virtually no residents, very few residents, not none, very few. But
we do have some, yeah.
It does have some, but you wanted to come in then.
Yeah. Yeah, and kind of quite different groups of residents. So, you know, we have numerous estates in the city, and obviously some really affluent residents as well. But I think, as you say, Joe, it's really made us think about where is our place, what is our locale, and what's our role in it. And I think, you know, yes, for us as well, place has become, you know, even more important than it was before. So I think what it surfaced for us was that, you know, as a lot of things shift online, that issue about digital inequality, of course, became even more apparent. You know, and in London, I think it's half of all people in London who are living in poverty have no access to Wi-Fi. So I think we started to think about, as you say, power and social responsibility, and the role we could play kind of physically in people's lives during this last difficult year, and the well-being of our community, particularly those who are the most vulnerable. So our kind of fantastic programming team designed a series of play and imagine packs, which were kind of creative resource packs, but physical objects, which, you know, I can say this, I thought was quite ingenious to really kind of buck the trend of where everyone else was going about how they could shift things online and think about what it meant to have, you know, a real physical resource posted through your door. And so, you know, they worked to create, you know, new relationships, not only within our patches you say, Jeff, because we have relatively few residents, but with our neighbouring boroughs. You know, obviously there's an awful lot of people there, as I say, you know, a lot of whom are quite vulnerable. So, you know, really trying to create, you know, brand new bridges into communities locally was an enormous challenge, but one that the team pulled off and distributed kind of almost 14,000 packs to date. You know, they're still going strong with different ideas. So yeah, I think it's been interesting to see the shift.
That's really interesting. And one final comment from me before I move on to our last question, last theme, and that is about place and digital, I think, and global. I think there is a great danger of assuming these are either or, and I think what we've got are some of the answers. They're not either or, they intersect. And during my cultural value project, we funded some research on electronic music composition, which is a global network of people who share electronic music composition, except when you track where they are, most of them cluster in Berlin, London, or San Francisco. That is that they behave as a global network, but actually they're very concentrated because people need to be together, as well as needing to collaborate with others around the world. And I think that just reinforces this point about it's not digital or place. It's about the relationship between them. I'm going to move us on to our final question, which is a very focused question about place. It's even more precise places. It's about the physical co-location of cultural institutions or cultural practitioners and creative enterprises, bringing artists and creative businesses together and seeing what happens when they come together. There have been experiments in this. Sometimes it happens in a district, sometimes it happens in a building for that purpose. Does it help new collaborations? Does physical co-location actually help new collaborative innovation? And if we're going to have, if it is something that's quite positive, if you conclude it is, can it be planned, or does it happen organically? And I know that Jim, the issue of planning and organic is something that you have some thoughts on, but
I think both. I think it's really interesting. I think not so much physical, but obviously in Newcastle and the North East, we had the Creative Fuse project, which is an AHRC funded project, which followed on from the Brighton Fuse, which looked at this specifically in a more broader sense. And there were some great examples of how it worked in there, but whether you could consider that sort of forced collaboration or not is a different question. Probably not one for today. But I think if you I tend to think if you co-locate people, I mean, Newsburn Valley in Newcastle is a really interesting one that is mentioned in the report, but is out of the scope of the area that we were talking about. And just along from Newsburn Valley, there's also a place called Holt's Yard, which is a microcosm of, say, what Truman's is like in London, if people are aware of that. And I think by having those people co-located, artists and sort of more tech creative digital businesses, there has been a few examples of collaboration that have come through. And I think the more we let those sort of places grow organically, in my view, the more that will happen.
Yeah, thanks very much. Sarah, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little naughty and disagree. My sense is that there are, and there's so much in the literature, so I'll just repeat what we've probably all either read or experienced, that there are sort of top-down cultural districts that are planned and have an infrastructure lead, often on connectivity and big, shiny, interesting buildings and stuff like that. And then even Jim's wonderful reference to the Baltic and Liverpool. Then there's the sort of organic, and I don't like this term, but bottom up, as in give some space, really cheap or free, just see what happens. But it's not very often that this cheap, free, and see what happens sits right next to the long-term planned cultural district. And I think in some ways, just like if you take a really affluent area, actually, let me say that's not true. If you start with a housing estate and build a really affluent set of new apartments next to it, you'll think, no problem. All of those residents will just get along. think our experience probably socially says that doesn't happen often. We in some ways feel our differences more if we don't have more common ground that highlights what we have in common. I think sometimes the same things can happen around the different income level, sense of what is economically, going to be helpful or prosperous, what is good in terms of social, and those things that divide us, as well as, if you will, just the price points and being able to get a space, join a thing, sell a piece of work, you develop a service, that means that co-locations can sometimes enforce the inequity. But I would absolutely say cultural districts have a huge role to play, but maybe those values and power and how they see themselves. I mean, so beautifully illustrated by Sean's question. Should we work with our neighbors, or some of the amazing things happen in a different part of our city? They're key because there is that sense of intensity and distillation. At the same time, reaching out to other parts of the city where maybe that sort of organic growth versus policy-driven growth can have more interesting interplay without one needing to be over the other in our usual top-down, bottom-up. It's actually about almost two different value sets and listening in new ways. So I would actually say co-location can be problematic, but connecting in a locale rather than in a neighborhood or a district can be hugely beneficial.
Yeah. One of the that's really interesting, Sarah. And one of the problems with all this, and one looks historically at one of the classic examples of a naturally evolving cultural and creative district in Hoxton, in London in the 1990s, sorry, the real historian speaking, in the 1990s, that what happened there was that the artists started arriving and drove out the poorer residents and the little traditional workshops. And then when the artists had made the area fashionable, in came the high earning creative industries, the advertising industry, the design industry and so on, and they drove out the artists. And so actually keeping that co-location working is quite difficult when there's competition for space, and some can pay for it and some cannot. But I just want to throw that in. But Mal, the Dundee experience of physical co-location.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started the Biome Collective in a giant MC unit in a building called Vision Building, which 10 years before that was built through Scottish Enterprise. So, government intervention, state of the art, building, etc. But it lay vacant for a number of years. So we were part of a small community that were, that kind of took over one of the units, or supported through, again, an individual, local external, kind of institution. So, for example, Neon Dish Last Festival took over the unit, opened up to ourselves, even Creative Dundee and other individuals and freelancers. And we actually we were in that space for about 5 years. We got kicked out this year just because finally the unit was filled up, right? But it was just a classic thing where I think there's the tech angle from a digital point of view is very easy. The story of tech is very easy to sell to local authorities. It's going to make you money. The growth thing is easy fabricated, quite frankly. Very easy to kind of fabricate that narrative of we're going to make everyone rich. We're going to solve the problems at the other end of town because we make money, etc. So that's an easy narrative for local authority to kind of jump in bed with, build all these kind of cool spaces. But the reality is very different. Quite often they've been abandoned in places like Dundee and other places. I mean, even another example in Dundee, District 10 it's called, which was again vacant for a number of years. So what I've seen success is where, again, people on the ground, the artist, the facilitator, the individual business owner who is in the creative industries, in the creative sector, who is aware of the innovation that's within our grasp through collaboration, through diverse representation. It's those situations that are kind of being curated, I would say, where there's been success stories. So I think you do need curation in order to make sure you have diverse spaces. It's not just design, it's not just marketing, it's not just games, it's a bit of everything. You need that kind of ecosystem, essentially. And ecosystems, they need support, they definitely do, but they start organically from the ground up. And that's where we need to the support needs to come into those individuals who are picking up all the work, essentially. So it's certainly been great for Dundee when it's worked, and we've lost that space, but there'll be another space. That's I have no doubt, because there's plenty of empty, even shopping districts, etc. There's so much empty space that I think we need, as a creative industry, we need to really be emboldened to be very confident to actually go in and take over these spaces in a way that is open for all.
Sari, briefly, because we need to be...
Very. Oh, no, you know what? I'll save it. It's okay.
No, go on, say it. Go on.
Well, it was during the pandemic when the Lowry, which is a huge art center at Salford Quays, closed and Box on the Docks opened. I got a great call from the head of regeneration and the council for Salford Quays saying we've discovered something really amazing. And doing CCTV and analysis of CCTV footage, they started to, number one, people came back, even visitors came back to Salford Quays, even once all the hospitality had closed. It didn't drop at all, but it meant that they went back and looked again at CCTV footage about the Lowry and started to understand the direct relationship between cultural institutions, cultural offer, and footfall. The Lowry's they just celebrated their 20-year anniversary, but in some ways it took the absence and the presence of something new that was supposed to be temporary, and then the interest in the data to start to change the way that the policymakers in Salford were thinking about culture in relation to, you know, in that in some ways it's going, oh no, but in other ways it's a pivot. And I think the sticker twist that a lot of cultural districts are really grappling with now, that pivot often means a change of direction that's close to begin with, but over time can really change the outcomes.
Well, this is one of the issues which, when I said in my opening comments that one of the things about big crises is they don't always lead to long-term change, unless there has already been a trend in that direction that is accelerated by the crisis. And I think what you're describing is probably that's been learned now, but it was a tension that was there beforehand. And as now the crisis has revealed some potential there. The discussion, the point about curation that you made, Mal, is one that I think feeds what everyone's been saying, comes back to one of the key issues being curation. The question then is, who does the curating? And this might link to the one thing that most people would say is that governments can't do curation. But one of the questions that's been there, the one question I want to pick up before we wind up in a moment, is about the role of government. In all your cities, the point is made that National Lottery has been a key factor leveraging the cultural attractions and the creative workspaces, and that DCMS in England has dabbled at this. I'm not sure that DCMS does much more than dabble with lots of things, but it's dabbled with this cultural development fund. But what do you think governments should now be doing to support strategic cultural growth, placemaking, and I'd add to that the kind of creative interactions we've been talking about in cities? Just brief answers, please, because we haven't got very long. Jim, as a representative of government.
Very quickly, I sat on the panel that made informed and helped and advised the government on what decisions they made for the Culture Development Fund. And what was really interesting with all those discussions, and I'm trying to be as quick as possible, is the interlink between culture, cultural organisations, what the applicants wanted to do with culture and what they wanted to do to grow the cultural sector, but how it linked to business and training and skills development. And as far as I'm aware, the applicants that came out strongest and got the limited funding that was available were the ones that had those interactions and that could show and demonstrate those interactions. And for me, it's important that they carry on in that way.
That's really interesting. That's a really interesting example of what actually has been done. Any other thoughts on the role of not local government now, but central government in this? Sian?
Yeah, I think there's something about joining up that national policy between kind of industry, trade and industry side and DCMS side. So I think, you know, for a long time it's been, if we talk about the economic impact or value of culture, it's in terms of GVA, but that's really it. And so actually that potential about the creative economy to really be at the heart of our economy, I think there's a lot more they could be doing to make that case centrally within government.
And from what we've heard today, it's also links into urban regeneration.
Brings it all together, skills, education. Brings
together a lot of things, which is why the fact that we've been talking about cultural districts and creative economy is very meaningful in these terms. I'm going to ask you all a final question before we wind up. And it's really it's really a bit cheeky to ask you this question, but you all knew lots about this subject when you came into it, or you wouldn't have been here on the panel. What have you learned over this discussion in hearing other panelists and questions that has made you think in a way that you didn't quite think when you came onto the panel in the first place? Anyone willing? Mal, were you waving your hand or
I can jump in. Yeah, I think for me, being in a Dundee bubble, the community, sometimes I don't get the chance to kind of pull out and see what's going on. And I think the discussion we've had today and previously, I think it's been nice to me that the social side of things has been quite important. It's a number of different individuals in different capacities, and that's just nice to see, because we have some major social challenges as a society, as a country, and it's nice to see that people in the creative industries try to tackle them, in a broad spectrum of ways. So that's just been nice. It's nice for me to kind of be aware that people are doing stuff. People are trying, which is lovely.
Thanks, Mal. Sian.
I think what struck me most actually was Joe saying that a lot of the workers within the Pervasive Media Studio were freelancers, which for some reason I didn't expect. So I think, kind of musing on that and your idea, Jeff, that, maybe freelancers really are that kind of bridge and connection between the sectors, and how we can harness that, I think, is particularly interesting.
Thanks. Anybody else learned anything they're willing to tell us now? Sorry, nobody putting you on the spot, but Jim?
I think what I've learned is that it's really important to take stock of different approaches. And I think it's really important when making an approach or deciding on which way you're going to go, that you consider all the aspects of how what you create or how you establish a district is going to link with business, going to link with the freelance sector, going to link with the cultural sector. So try as much as possible before you actually put a spade in the ground, if it's a building, for example, to actually think about what the approach is to try and get some of these things right in the first place.
Thanks very much. We've just about reached the 4:15 when we're meant to be stopping. So unless Sari and Joe have something brief they want to add at this point, I will wind.
I'll just say briefly, I think these conversations are the most interesting, and for me, I learn the most when we're willing to be honest.
Yeah. By which I hope you mean you think everyone has been pretty honest today, which I think you all have as well. We've kept our numbers up really high through to 4:15 when we were scheduled to stop. So 4:15 UK time. I'm not going to try and sum all of this up. But what I will simply say is that what I think we have learned from the report and from this excellent conversation is the very integrated nature of this area. And back to your point, Jim, you can't simply make simple decisions about what is needed, either as an organization or as a local government, without actually exploring the real complex ecology in which it all goes on. And I think we've learned some great things today. Thank you to all of you who've been attending, listening, asking your questions, putting stuff in the chat. And thanks particularly to my 5 fellow panelists on your really excellent contributions. Thanks so much. Okay, bye to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.